Good evening, everyone. Hi, Neil. Welcome to our last event of 2012. It's been a great year, a year of growth for NYTEC, and we've got great things planned for next year and hope to see you back as our events pick up in January. Tonight we've got a great panel discussion. Should be very exciting. Topic is perfecting your business development strategies. And I'll let Veronica introduce the panel, but let me just thank the people we should thank for our being here. Our annual sponsors, if it weren't for them, we literally would not be here. Their support makes all of our activities possible, and I won't mention all of them, or any of them, in fact. You can see them, they're on your program. Want to mention that we partner with lots of organizations. This list continues to grow. And part of our philosophy is we want to work with as many organizations as want to work with us, and that's a growing number. We have a number of media partners, and I think that they're an important part of the ecosystem here in New York. I want to give a special thanks to Anchin and Stephen Pletman. There he is. He's got his arm up. He's a partner here at Anchin, and this is a great space. We've been using it frequently recently, and thank you. And with that, let me introduce Veronica, and take it away.
So thank you all so much for coming today. I'm Veronica Sansev. I'm the CEO and founder of InSpark. And I'm going to start by quickly introducing the panel, and then I'll introduce kind of the topic and how tonight's going to proceed. So I'm going to start with Laurie, who's on the far right. Laurie Davis is the founder of eFlirt Expert, and eFlirt Expert is a dating consultancy, an online dating consultancy that she founded in 2009 with $50 in a Twitter account. And you know, as an entrepreneur, Laurie obviously has to do all kinds of deals, whether it's with her publicists or with other dating sites. So she'll be speaking from that experience. Mary Park, perfect. I was like going in order when I wrote that. Awesome. So Mary is a mobile advertising and mobile commerce consultant, and I've known Mary for quite a while. I think, did we actually meet doing a deal? No, but
we probably met like 7-8 years ago, so it's been a while.
But previously, Mary was the co-founder and VP of Business Development for a mobile company called Crisp Media, and she's done deals with huge companies like Hearst and Time and Paramount Pictures and Google and PayPal, so very well versed in doing deals with large companies. Heidi and I actually met in doing a deal.
Make a deal.
Heidi is the co-founder and CEO of MoxieQ, and she's a media and technology entrepreneur. So MoxieQ is a digital and social media lifestyle consultancy. So they match brands with influencers, and they focus on categories like fitness, home, design, floral, beauty, fashion, and travel. And Heidi and I met when she was at Third Screen Media. She's actually the founder of Third Screen Media. And I was at AOL, and we were working on a deal together. So
and it turned out to be a very pivotal deal because they purchased our company. So
that's right. That's
good
right.
Business development work.
That's right. And then Katherine Long is the director of client services at EachScape. She brings 9 years of mobile and account management experience working for companies like Group Commerce, Mblocks, Boku, Namco, and Handango. So, you know, Katherine's managed relationships with some of the largest companies in the world, including everything from media companies, carriers, OEMs, in the US, South America, and EMEA. So she'll really be speaking from the account management perspective, because we all know, you know, when you're a biz dev executive kind of closes the deal, but it gets reopened later, you know, Katherine's the one who's got to deal with those kinds of problems, and also upselling and things like that. So just to provide a little context on everyone's expertise and what they're bringing to this discussion. So today we're going to talk about, to introduce the topic, we're going to talk about business development, really from prospecting to getting the first meeting to ultimately getting the deal. And I want this to be interactive. I've kind of organized the questions in a way that first kind of defines the topic, then talks about that prospecting phase, talks about the first meeting, and then negotiations, and then close it. So the first question, kind of to tee up, you know, what does business development mean? So a lot of people ask me this question, like, what is business development? Because it really can mean anything, from sales to account management. And I want to start off just quickly by asking each of the panel members to share, what it means to them. So I guess, Katherine, since you're closest to me, you can start off.
So I think business development to me is more of a relationship-driven sale. It's selling, but it's selling something that the client needs and something that makes sense for both partners. So it's a long-term proposition versus a one-time deal.
Heidi?
Yeah, I think, looking at sales, sales tends to be very quota-driven and transactional, and I would agree with Katherine. Business development is much more about the long game. It's very relationship-oriented, and ultimately the goal, of course, is to generate revenue, but that revenue could be months away. There might be other things that are just as valuable in the short term. So it's much more of a building process than sales, which is close it quickly and move on to the next one.
It's hard to add anything new, but I would tend to agree. It's very relationship driven. I think it's much more strategic. I actually think you should know your product or service very, very well in order to do great business development, because I think, what Veronica was saying, there are some people out there who think business development is just about kind of going out there and networking and making connections. And while that's part of it, if you don't, close a deal or forge a relationships that's strategic for your company or brings in money at some point, there really isn't a point to it, so.
Yeah, I agree that business development is definitely about the relationships, but I'd add that it's also about conceptualizing and knowing who you're trying to sell to very well, and what's going to benefit them. My business wouldn't be what it is today without all of my partnerships, and part of that is not only growing the relationship, but really understanding what would help grow their business in addition to mine.
So to kind of feed off of that question, let's say your company needs to do a business with a major media company, and you ultimately want promotion, but you're not sure what you can offer. How do you figure out what the right deal is? How do you figure out the right value exchange, and what even that partnership should look like? How do you think through that?
I guess I'll take it first stab. I mean, to expand on what Laurie was just saying, it really is very much about partnerships. So finding the right partners, and also, how do you make, especially if I work for a smaller technology company, how do I make a company like Google or PayPal pay attention to me, right? So that's part of, you have to figure out what you can deliver to them strategically as well. So, do they get more revenue? Do they get a relationship, or are they getting some kind of technology that we don't think they have yet? So you really have to think about what both partners get from the relationship, I think.
And understanding what they're looking for too, even if they're not doing it now. Are they, if you notice a company is trying to push events, there may be something you can collaborate on together that will help them, get butts and seats at events. Or if they're really focused on customer acquisition and they're doing a lot of advertising, maybe they'd be interested in collaborating on something that doesn't need to impact their ad spend as much.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it comes down to just gives and gets, and sometimes to get that information, there's research you can do, but oftentimes for me, it's really understanding the ecosystem on a very personal basis, and that might mean a lot of informational meetings with people, and just hey, I kind of want to pick your brain about this, or let's have a coffee, and then from that, you can get a pretty good map of, the particular partnership you're trying to forge, and then you'll better understand the value that you can provide. So it's that long relationship coffee process that goes into dating too, right?
Yeah.
And Katherine, how is that different from an account management perspective?
It's really not different from an account management perspective, outside the fact that account management will also bring in the day-to-day execution piece to it. But when you're looking at, trying to find synergies and how you can grow the account, you're really looking at it from how you can help their business. How you can help their business grow will help your business grow. So everything these ladies said, it's spot on.
Awesome. So it's a perfect transition into prospecting, because we kind of started to touch on that topic. So you've identified a partner, you've thought through maybe some of the value exchange or had an initial conversation. How do you go about researching the company, whether it's the right contact or what their needs are? How do you go about doing that?
I think online obviously is a great resource right now, just to kind of understand those types of things, company websites, but I also think just paying attention to social media and what the company does there. Social media for me has really changed and transformed my entire business development process. I mean, I do run a social media oriented consultancy, but I think paying attention to Twitter and LinkedIn, in addition to the drill down that you might do just from a company website or having conversations, is a phenomenal way to kind of keep on the pulse of what a company's needs might be, what's top of mind. In particular, Twitter. I mean, that's a pretty transformative marketing channel, at least for some of the companies I'm doing business with day to day.
And you can find individuals on Twitter too.
Right.
So it's not always about watching what the brand is doing. Most of the deals I've done have been from people that I started Twitter relationships with. You can jump in on conversations they have, you can watch what the brand is doing too, and then you can start DMing with them and take things from a personal level and get offline. But just like in dating, it all has to get offline eventually. If you stay online, it's just not as much of a personal relationship, and it's hard to develop beyond broadband.
And I think to add, I think before you prospect, I've always worked at companies where I was the biz dev person and we also had sales guys. So it's like, how do you differentiate your role from what they're doing? And I think, the sales guys, in order for a company to succeed, the sales guys are given a quota, they're given a formulated way to sell usually, and they're supposed to go out there and pound the streets. As a biz dev person, that's why I say, you have to understand your product or service very well, because you're saying, well, what is it that's also going to bring the company in money, but not necessarily from the sales, but from, let's say, a huge carrier partner or a Google-like partner, and it's a little bit different. That's going to add to our product, maybe. If you don't understand what your service or your product is, obviously you're not going to know what relationships to make. So that's part of it. Once you define those companies, then basically, things like LinkedIn, very, very effective. You often find within a certain ecosystem in a certain industry, you're usually 1, 2, at the most 3 away. You can find a way in. So
I was just going to add, where it used to be so difficult sometimes to get that referral. Yeah. It's like, oh, I want to speak to Tom Jones because he's the CMO. It's a lot simpler now. Either for LinkedIn for that type of thing, or as Laurie was saying, in our business at one time we wanted to get in touch with the New York Housewives. That's like a whole story. And we went to the head of Bravo. We had a relationship with Bravo, and she was just like, I'd love to do that, but really what that means is talking to each one of their publicists individually. So I hired this young college kid to tweet during all the Housewives shows, tweet out to the Housewives, let's get some buzz going. And before long, I'd say within a 3-month period, every single housewife from that show was doing the type of business with us that I'd set out to accomplish initially. So just to reinforce, social media, LinkedIn, Twitter are just fabulous ways to reach either, whatever type of company or individual that you're hoping to do business with. And it's just an accelerator.
Awesome, that's incredible insight. Now, kind of to take it to the next level, do you go cold or do you go through an introduction? How do you actually contact that person once you've figured out who you need to meet?
I mean, I'll just say for me, I'm just that type of person. I was a salesperson and a business development person, so I'm pretty much just going cold. But if I know somebody, or I'm like, oh, I think Mary knows that person, I'm absolutely not afraid to ask for an introduction. It's always better if a trusted resource can say, meet Heidi, she's okay. But if I don't see that, I'll absolutely go in cold. I will say I've had more success personally going in cold on Twitter than I have on LinkedIn. I think because in LinkedIn, the people I've been trying to contact are, they're more corporate. It is like a CMO or a CEO. That's a little different than going after a New York housewife, right? It's been more formal channels there where you tweet out to a New York housewife and after like, okay, what do you want? So.
I think also that LinkedIn as a platform is less interactive, so it's easier to make a natural segue to conversation with people on Twitter. But also I would say that I also make a lot of introductions, and sometimes people don't ask me to make them. I just meet someone and my brain, I guess, naturally matchmakes, and I think, oh, you would be great for so-and-so. I know that they were looking for someone like that, or your businesses might be synergetic or whatever. Goals in common. And when you do that, then people will make more introductions for you just on a whim without having to always be the one that comes up with the ideas for the partnerships too.
Now, when it comes to, you've got a relationship in the company, you may have gotten one entry point. Do you talk to multiple people in the company? Should you only stick to one person? How do you kind of establish that balance?
I actually think multiple ways in is good. You're lucky if you get a response even after multiple ways. So, like Heidi said, I prefer the warm intro because then hopefully your email or your call stands out a little bit above somebody else's. But at some point you're going to run out of, your connection, so you're going to have to go cold. So when you go cold, just like everyone else, it's how do you stand out a little bit. And the thing is, when you're going cold, find multiple ways in. Sometimes you hit the lower level person and you know that they're actually doing exactly what you need, so you hopefully they'll respond, but other times they'll ignore you, and then you happen to email the CMO cold, and for whatever reason it piqued his interest, and then he'll introduce his colleague in, and then there you go, you start talking. So it's really hard to, say.
Yeah, I was just thinking, where I've had really good success just with like cold intros is like if LinkedIn isn't working for me and Twitter isn't working, is Facebook. I know that sounds ridiculous because Facebook's more like it's your friends, it's your family, it's just whoever. But that's where I've been able to form some relationships with people I don't know around common interests. Like this person likes barbecue or this person likes martini, so we'll kind of get this dialogue going. And so sometimes as a last resort, like let's say I wanted to talk to somebody at Verizon that was high up, I'll just be like, hey, Facebook people, does anyone know someone at Verizon? And now these contacts I wouldn't otherwise have are like, hey, I always talk with Heidi about barbecue. She spends some time in Kansas City. So I have that informal relationship, but they feel connected to me on a personal, emotional level, which is how a lot of things will get done. So I've gotten really valuable introductions because it's not encased in business, it's encased in this personal relationship I've developed on Facebook. So I actually would say that 1 out of every 5 really good intros I have come through Facebook.
I can speak through experience too. We're Facebook friends, but we just met.
That's right. So we're very tight. We're doing a deal immediately after this.
And I think, just to give another perspective, I'm a little bit more private with my Facebook. I'm friends with some business people, but I'm actually getting more and more private with it. So I don't know how much business networking I'm going to do through my own, personal Facebook account. But if you don't have that, if you can't figure out how to make that connection right away and you are starting to cold email, which in some cases you're always going to have to do, the way social media can become kind of advantageous in a different way is if you found an article that somebody wrote or, they were quoted in some periodical or whatever, and you basically take that and you kind of, somehow find a way to make the subject line reflective of the fact that you read his article. Something like that, a cold email, it makes it much more, hey, this person actually knows what I'm talking about, happen to read an article and you just stand out a little bit above all the other spam mail that he's getting. And so that's just, in case you're also in a business that's not necessarily so driven by social media. If you're in a boring old, SaaS enterprise, something where they don't happen to tweet all the time, so you can't make that connection. You have to find other ways of using regular email or phone to get in. So.
And how about you, Katherine? Are you connecting with your customers over social or more over traditional?
No. I tend to stick to traditional, LinkedIn for sure, but Facebook for me, I have too much interaction already with them. I like to keep that limited a little bit. But definitely, it's all about working, and a lot of the business development people will have laid the groundwork for me. So once I start, I already have a lot of contacts, but it's really into maintaining those contacts and then extending the reach into the company so that they know that we are, become a part of their business.
Well, so Heidi, Veronica, and I all met because of mobile. We were in mobile from the early days, and pretty much, we went to every conferences, and all of which trade shows and conferences to go to. It's pretty much 3 to 4 that are kind of unmissable. Yep. And even if you don't want to go, you end up going because people might think your company's dead if you don't show up. So you end up going to 3 or 4 huge trade shows. They're a little bit, they're hard to manage, but at the same time, when you go there, everyone's there. You're having hours, meetings hour upon hour. You go to, there are 3 to 4 parties every night. You pretty much end up knowing who everyone is in the ecosystem. And then which relationships you have to boards or how to get in there. And so at least that was the way it worked for us. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a different question, probably. I'm jumping ahead, but just taking off of what Mary's saying, I mean, I think just that informal networking to begin business development, whether it's over a cocktail or a coffee or at a conference, I mean, that's how you really understand even the value, because you meet somebody, it's like, oh, I've done a deal with Dan, you know, here's what they're kind of looking for. So that can help you form a picture of the value that you can bring. And, you know, maybe you thought you were supposed to talk to Mark, that would be the perfect one, but it's like, no, Dan's got the budget, so he's definitely the one that you want to target. So I think networking is as you said initially, it's superficial, that's all you're doing, but it is a key part of business development, is just chunking away at your ecosystem and knowing everybody within it.
And knowing that a lot of RSVPs are online now too, on Eventbrite or on the conference website, you can see what companies are going and who you make goals for who you want to meet at certain events.
This is a perfect segue, because the next thing that we wanted to talk about is using networking to get context. And actually, all of us, the common thread between all five of us is Women in Wireless, which is specifically a networking organization for women in the mobile field. And you know, one thing I just want to add to all of the stuff with networking is if you don't have the right venue to meet people, or even if you want ways to build closer relationships with people, like creating an organization or all kind of joining an organization is also, you know, a good way to do that. That's like we're all good friends and have been doing business with each other throughout the industry for a while, just from that connection. So talking about events, like, you know, Mary mentioned, you know, there's must-have conferences that you go to. Like, if you're kind of new to a field, how do you figure that out? How do you kind of survey the landscape? Because especially in some place like New York, where there's easily 3 things you can be at every day, how do you determine what are the right events to go to, where you're going to meet the right kind of partners?
Well, some of it is easy because you know, I mean, once you know what your company's about, what you're trying to sell, you know which trade journals and associations and events, consequently events you should be working with. So that in a way it becomes a self-selecting process. And also if your company gains any visibility, trust me, you'll start getting bombarded.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, you know, so you're going to know who, you know, what all the conferences are and where to go to. I think at some point you have to start becoming selective, because even in every industry, it seems like now every month, you know, there's 3 to 4 conferences to go to. So you also have to filter. I mean, part of why you're at your company is to work, not just to go to conferences. So, you know, I think basically you start knowing. If you go to a few, you know which ones everyone's going to be at. You want to go to the ones where you can meet people and do business with that. So, you know.
Awesome. Laurie, anything to add to that?
I do, because there aren't a lot of dating conferences. So I had to think creatively about what other industries would have synergy with everything I was doing. So I started in tech, and then I kind of expanded out through there. Go to a lot of lifestyle kind of events, because for me, doing a deal isn't just always with the dating site. It's with brands that are similar to, and that can kind of transition and find value in what we do, but also have like-minded consumers. So for me, it was really thinking about what other companies would be of interest, and then figuring out where they were going to be.
I think too, just in managing conferences, because Mary's right, and we all go through this, it's like, oh my God, I've only been at conferences for like the past month. I mean, conferences aren't really about presentations and panels. Ultimately, it's about access to people. So what I would do once, especially in mobile, because it seemed like there's like a conference every other day, and in New York, there's always a conference. You know, you pick 1 or 2, or you're there for the long haul, you're at the conference, but you can also just schedule an afternoon and set up meetings there, because your colleagues from St. Louis or San Francisco or whatever might be at this conference. So it's a great place just to connect with people face to face for a moment and get your business development work done or network with them. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to put all that time into a day-long conference. It's access to people, so it can be quick.
Now, are there any bad places to network? Any place you would say, like, definitely parties, anything? Yeah.
I would say no. I mean, I think it depends on how you're networking. Like, I can say this is more, I guess, fundraising than business development, but it's all kind of the same. I was raising money for a small little, it was a gay media portal, actually, an LGBT portal, and I did meet one of my investors at a bar. I mean, I got them interested, and they ended up putting money in, and that would never be a place that you would typically recommend. It's like, yeah, do your networking in a bar at social functions. I mean, I think typically conferences or, other more public venues are probably the better way to meet people, but I wouldn't discount anywhere because anybody can be a potential partner. You just never know.
I always said that I think with business development, if you can't get creative in terms of meeting people or structuring deals or figuring out who your partners are, I think what's going to make you a better business development person is to figure out that partner that somebody else hasn't figured out, right? So if there are 5, I should make a deal with Google, that's fine, you have to find a way in, but who's that one partner that's going to bring you enhanced revenue or opportunities that your competitors are thinking about? So it takes creativity that way. I think another way is just like Heidi said, it's like you can't rule anything out. It's a combination of cold calling, dialing, meeting people, whether it's at a bar or at a conference or whatever, your lobby. You have to make the connections about connecting the dots, I think. So.
And just be like, this goes back to what Mary said too, knowing your product well. Like I did not go to that bar to, meet an investor. It just sort of happened. So as a business development person, I think you just have to be open at any time and thinking this is an opportunity and I can talk about my business. Like expect the unexpected and be knowledgeable because you might be missing a great opportunity that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Now, is there like a right title or a right level of person to speak with? Like, how do you know, is it if you need to reach the marketing person, if you need to reach the CEO? Like, how do you identify the right decision maker at a company when you've identified the deal that you need to do? Or do you start wherever you get to?
I think what we were saying before, it's like you kind of put out as many emails or tweets or whatever it is to get to somebody, and when you get to them, that's the person you have to work with, right? Yes. So I think that ideally everybody would love to talk to the CEO or the CMO. I mean, you want to go as high as you can, but if you're starting with a junior media buyer, well, okay, that's who you're starting with. So you make the best of it, and then you kind of go over, under, and through, I think.
So talk about that over, under, and through, because you get to the media buyer, and you're like, great, I'm talking to them about this big strategic opportunity, which is way above their pay grade. And, how do you navigate without pissing them off? Because they are your relationship in the company.
Well, so assuming they like what I'm doing, you make them the hero. You say, you know what, I'd love to come in and present to the group. Could you get a group together? So I'd love to get everybody's feedback on what we're doing. Or, hey, I'd love to take your team to lunch. How about setting a lunch up? And then, we can talk more about, MoxieQ or whatever the product or service happens to be. So you want to keep them involved. I mean, they're going to know they can't close that deal. They're a junior media buyer. But what are they trying to do? They want to look like they understand what companies are going to be beneficial to their company, right? What partners. So if you give them the, the green light to set up a bigger lunch or a presentation, you've made them look important.
Any other tips or tricks for kind of leveling up your discussions?
I would say that for the most part, at least in my experience, that dealing with someone, you have to know that they're a decision maker. So I try to always get into the decision maker first. Obviously, like Heidi said, I tried to make the best of it if I didn't get into the decision maker. But you pretty much know when you're doing strategic deals or you're trying to actually do a creative deal, you need somebody that's going to be able to make a decision on the other side. So it depends on the relationship.
And I'd say keep them excited, because if they could stop moving things forward very easily. It could drop off before it gets to the decision maker. So the more excited you can keep them about what you're doing and your idea and how they would be involved, the more likely they are to keep things going.
And how is that different from an account management perspective? Like, you could run into hiccups on implementation or something. How do you get to the right person? And how do you network even within the companies to make sure you know the right people when problems come up?
Exactly. I think it's all about building the right relationship with your existing contacts and letting them know that they can trust you with whatever it's that, equal partnership. And, once you have that in there, most of them, if they're going to help champion you if you're helping champion them. So making them the hero, as Heidi said, making them look good in front of their boss, and helping encourage their career growth. So
Awesome. And then, sometimes you'll meet people, if your company has enough traction, you'll get inbound interest. How do you quickly kind of evaluate which opportunities are worth pursuing and which are not? And then, as a secondary point to that, how do you communicate that in a way that kind of keeps those relationships going for the future?
I think one very simple way, I still remember at some point when we had gotten some traction, whereas before I always felt like I was on the sell side, at one point I felt like I was on the buy side, because you're just getting so many, like, let's do this, and you're not even sure what half of it is that they want to do. All of a sudden, I felt like I was on the buy side, and I would say, one of the easiest ways, because you have to filter fast, is if there's only one of you, one of the easiest ways was I wouldn't really give that much time to a partner that actually did not see my point of view, like Laurie was saying. Instead of trying to tell me how this is going to be good for me, they were basically trying to sell me on why it was good for them, and that's great, but it's not a charity on either side. So you're just kind of like, well, that's great, but obviously already he hasn't figured out why it would be good for me, which is why I think what Laurie said before is so important. So that was a very, very easy way to filter for me.
For me, it's been hard because I'm an entrepreneur and my team is supporting me, but ultimately I'm the decision maker. So, but to look through every deal for me is a lot of time. So I work with a consultant who does PR and marketing for me, and if it's a deal that maybe isn't with a big dating site or isn't something that I'm sure about when it comes through, I'll have him do the first call, get a feel for if it would be a good fit to then move forward with or not.
I mean, I think just to keep the relationship going on those types of things, if it's not a perfect fit, and this is probably because I'm sales business development person, so sometimes I do have a hard time shutting people down. But I always say, hey, if it becomes part of your strategy to do X, whatever would be beneficial to me as a company, then hit me up again, because I don't want to just say no and slam the door. I mean, unless it's completely irrelevant, and I'll just say, this isn't a fit at all.
Yes.
But usually it's like, hey, if they just shifted a little bit, if their strategy changed, then maybe you could work together. So I always leave them with something to come back with.
Or if they had a different idea.
Yeah, right.
I was nice about it, I just shut it down in my mind. I didn't necessarily tell them, so I was just trying to tell you, how I follow.
Well, you can suck up a lot of time, though.
Yeah.
I think that's important, because that's my general thought, is like, because, you always hate it when you write to someone and you're like, that guy didn't even get back to me, I wish they would just pick up the phone and call me and tell me no. So that was what I always said, I'm always at least going to talk to somebody. But if you don't cut it off, that was like 2 hours later, and you're like, oh my God, that was...
But I think, going back to what I said before, when you're trying to get someone's attention, and especially on a strategic level, you do, like Laurie said, you have to show not only why it's good for me, but why it's good for you. This is why this is a partnership. This is why you should take your time. People who don't bother to figure that out, that's their problem. That's their homework that they did not do. So.
It's not a partnership.
Yeah.
It's only beneficial to one party.
Right. So.
Now, do you guys use any CRM tools or any tools to kind of keep track of all of these relationships? Anything you suggest?
I love Salesforce.
Yeah, I was gonna say Salesforce.com to like Excel thrown up on Google Drive, just depending. I'm informal about it, but I'm pretty organized. I'm an organized person. I don't know how. So. The many personalities I have in my head, one's organized. So.
Yeah, I'd agree. Salesforce and Excel, depending on the stage of the company.
Right, exactly. It's more organized than Salesforce.
Now we're gonna, our next topic is kind of preparing for the meeting and having the first meeting. So before we move on to that, I wanted to see if there were any audience questions around prospecting, anything that you felt like wasn't answered around that topic. Yeah, please.
When you actually reach and have a conversation with a high-level person, and they request information, and you end the call on a good note, and you follow up with them, and they don't get back to you, when does it become like stalking, and when is it okay to just keep hammering away?
It's subjective. It's so different in every situation, and with the personality and the context behind it. I mean, I don't want to say I'm a big one for stalking, but I'm pretty persistent in following up, and I'll try multiple ways to do it. I mean, if I haven't heard back from somebody that's requested information in like 2 weeks, I usually give them 2 weeks. I'll follow up usually with an email and then a call, and then I'll just let it go. And then my final one's like, hey, it looks like the timing's not quite right on this, but let's definitely stay in touch. And I'll usually remain active with them on social media too. That's like my little stalking.
Sometimes if they're really high level, they're not on social media.
Right,
They're
that's
not-
true.
They don't respond that way, they're too busy.
You
Yeah,
can
they-
always follow up with them later if you find something meaningful that they might be interested in, like an article that you
Yeah.
read, or if you find them being quoted somewhere, you can also follow up that way and say, wow, I saw that you were in this, like something about what it meant to you.
Or an industry, something in the industry. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, what do you think about
News in the
this?
industry.
I mean, I think one of the best tools just to be an effective business development person anyhow today is to become an influencer or an expert in your industry as much as you can. And that's, tweeting and posting on LinkedIn and getting a following. That does seem to help in terms of getting the attention of high-level people too, and gives you credibility, artificial or not.
Yeah, and actually, like, to add to that, I always say lead with value. So if you have a person on a list, like I put them, kind of create a Google alert for them, and then you can kind of start seeing what's happening. Even if you don't necessarily follow every move, you start seeing at least the bigger ones,
Yeah.
and then anything from that can start sparking an idea to reach out to them
Yeah,
again.
that's good.
Any other questions?
Obviously, you can spend all week calling people and talking to them, following up. Where do you cut it off as far as the quantity of people that you contact?
I mean, you want it to be targeted, right? So it just depends. If my target's just 5 for a certain thing, then I'll really focus on those 5. If it's 50 or it's infinite, then until I get exhausted, I guess. I mean, I think that's just part of business development to some degree. But if you're focused on a channel, there's probably an infinite number of prospects that are going to be the low-hanging fruit. And then there's those, those big ones that who knows if they're going to pay off or not. They're a little out there, but you're trying for those as well. I'm not sure if your question is more like budgeting time during a week, or when is it just like this isn't a plausible business development?
Well, it's a question more of the breadth of your content, of your prospects. In other words, you could keep expanding your prospects, and they could be valuable prospects, and you could have 5, 10, 50, 1,000. If you find yourself in a situation where your services or what you're doing are valuable to a larger pool of people, then you would feel comfortable or have enough time to follow up with. How do you limit it?
Well, I think also you need to focus, depending on what stage you're at, on the key accounts. Whatever that means to you. I mean, maybe it's landing a Fortune 500 company, maybe it's landing one in a different vertical. So you have to prioritize on whatever's important to you or your company or your business at that point in time. But I think when you're starting out and you're just at that prospecting phase, that's when the list has to be very big, because sometimes you're assuming category X is going to be the perfect business development partner for you. And through conversations, recognizing patterns, getting to really understand your industry, it's like, wow, actually it's over here. That's more sort of the learning your ecosystem. Once you've learned it, then you probably have a smaller targeted list with a very specific objective, like signing that first Fortune 500 account or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
And when you're first starting out too, one of the tips that I give in my book, Love at First Click, is to set a goal for yourself for the day for how many people you're going to reach out to on online dating, and it's kind of similar. So either set a goal that's a number or a time limit. If you have a lot of other responsibilities, a time limit might be a better thing, so you know that you're moving things forward, but that it's not taking over your entire work life either.
Yeah, and there's also other things you can do to make it efficient. So if your business is really taking off and you have more interest than you can handle, you can organize things like webinars as a way to have a conversation that's more one-to-many as opposed to one-on-one. Or maybe it's that your materials need to be a little bit crisper so that more of the filtering can happen through the materials that people read before they talk to you. Those are other suggestions. Any other questions on prospecting?
Well, just one question on webinars. So if the panel does use webinars, which application do they like to use for webinars?
We've used GoToMeeting.
I've used WebEx before. WebEx worked really well.
Yep, WebEx is great. And GoToMeeting. I get kicked off of that more for some reason.
All right, so we're going to move over.
I'm gonna get one more in the back.
Oh,
here.
I can't see through the column. Go ahead.
In terms of emailing, if you have materials to send, and you send an attachment versus a link versus something they can just see, I mean, do you have any suggestions on the most effective emails that you guys send that have more information about the company than just, you know, just a conversation? Like, just want to throw a couple blurbs in there to get their attention. Do you have any takes on that?
How do you get
I know what I
someone's
do,
attention?
but I just love to hear best practices.
So like crafting a headline that gets their attention, because it sounded like you were starting with attachments or, I mean, I try to be really succinct in my email, like, because what I found is, and I think Twitter's kind of responsible for this and Facebook, like everybody's used to brevity in their information, so people just don't read through big paragraphs anymore. So if the opening line is, we have a partnership with Hearst, you might be interested, or the opening line is, we just signed a deal with Target, or the opening line is, we've got a reach of 40 million, whatever you think it is that's gonna capture their attention, just a couple sentences there, and then I've attached more information for you to consider. You know, I think putting in an attachment and then just very brief.
I mean, I would tend to agree with Heidi, especially for initial email. I wouldn't really even attach anything, because I think that's just too much information.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, once there's interest, you know, it becomes a little bit like a relay. Once there's interest and they show you interest back, then you could feed them a little bit more information. Right?
And you can make it seem
Yeah.
more exclusive that way. too.
Exactly.
Like, they need to reach out back.
That's a
to
good
you.
point, like, we're not just saying this to everyone, that's a good point.
Any other questions on prospecting? Awesome. So let's talk about, you know, you found the person you need to find, you've made a connection, they'll take the meeting now. Awesome, so you're in a good place. And now you're getting ready for the meeting. Like, what do you do to prepare for that first meeting? You know, what do you research about the person, about the company, to make sure that that first meeting is most effective?
Everything. I mean, LinkedIn, web, talking to people that know the company, talking to people that know the person. And a lot of times whoever sets the meeting up, you can ask them to say, is this the appropriate direction to take the meeting? Here's what I'm going to talk about. And they'll usually confirm it. They'll be like, you know what, it would actually be better if you focused on X instead of Y. So you can sort of get a feel for what's going to make you successful in the meeting beforehand. I saw one of your things was you take a script and a presentation. So I actually do. I take a, I have a little script, I've got a presentation. I don't always use them, but I want them just in case I need to fall back on them. So I've got all my materials, and it could end up, sometimes it's just a very informal conversation, it just flows, and that's great, but I do a lot of research up front. I've got a PowerPoint with very specific, things I'd like to hit on each slide. If I need it, great. If I don't, then I just keep it very informal. But you've got to be very prepared.
Mary's nodding, so
Oh, no, I mean, I guess that's another, I'm just agreeing, so. But, yeah, definitely, I think that first meeting, for me, it's usually a deck, not too long, hopefully. It's really hard. I mean, I was working mostly for technology companies. I mean, even now I'm consulting, and you really should keep it succinct. Bring your point across. And it takes a lot of honing, and hopefully you're working with your marketing department, or if you don't have one yourself, to hone that message. And the only way that's going to happen is going to meetings and seeing people's reactions. But you want to keep the first presentation succinct, very clear. Also, how you're differentiated, so you're not just melting into this blur of all the other vendors that they're seeing, because you have to remember, the competition's fierce out there. So.
And Katherine, from an account management perspective, how do you prepare for the first meeting?
I mean, my preparation is having internal meetings with everyone who's spoken with the client to begin with. I want to know anything and everything about what discussions they've had, what's been promised, what potential expectations are, and then putting together a kickoff deck and making sure that I have that I've researched the business, that I know what they're trying to accomplish, how they're trying to accomplish, what timeframes they're trying to accomplish it in, and putting together a launch plan around that. So it's knowing all the members that are going to be in the room, knowing what their roles are and how they're going to interact with us.
And just to add to that, I mean, I'm only, again, just expounding upon it, but really, if you're going into a major Fortune 500 companies, just do a little bit of Google research. And if you find, 2 or 3 press releases that came out this year talking about some of their initiatives, and the executives are quoted, and, they're like, this is what we want to achieve, in 2013, blah, 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 and these are the people that you're talking to, you kind of have a clue as to what they're talking about, or at least saying, with a public face, whether it's happening or not. So, I think that's very important.
Now, you've had that all-important first meeting, you're there, you're presenting your opportunity or talking about potentially like ways you can work together, and now like the senior executive says, you know, I'll think about it, or, you know, I'm not sure I have budget, or this isn't my roadmap. Like, how do you deal with that and kind of keep the relationship going or turn it around? Like, what's your response?
I mean, if it's not on the roadmap, it's not on the roadmap, right? You can't force it. The last thing you want to do, I mean, it's just as Mary's been kind of emphasizing the value. If the value just isn't there to them, you can't force it to be. If it's a budget issue and it's an important client, you can always try to start with a pilot program and say, hey, can we start with something really small, as long as there's sort of that roadmap to something a little bigger, and what would make the pilot successful for you so you could sort of sell it through and get a budget behind it. So that's something that often works, and you know, many companies are very open to it. It's innovation.
I think something else that's important about business development too is remembering that even if the deal doesn't happen, it's still the relationship that's important. And keeping in touch with each other and really continuing to form that relationship, because things down the line change, new ideas happen, budgets change, and that's really where the long-term value is.
And do you have like a tactic for that? Do you say, no, I understand this is not a fit now, but I'd like to keep in touch, or like, how do you kind of do you get buy-in on that, or do you just keep in touch and hope for the best, or what do you do?
I just keep in touch, really, and keep coming up with ideas and going back to them in, you know, wait months in between, but repitch things that are totally different, especially when I notice something shift with the business, like they're focusing on something else, and then what value can I bring to the table, and how can we work together to help them achieve that. They just keep tabs really on like what they're doing.
Yeah. I think from the client side as well, even if your partner isn't willing or able to move to another product line or move to, in my case, another application, it's all about knowing what else is going on in the industry and trying to help them build that product and build that case to then expand in the future.
Now, talk about that for a minute, Katherine, because you mentioned another application, and what you're talking about there is like really upselling. So you're getting in and you've sold them, you know, product A, and you have, you know, B and C that you're tasked with upselling. Like, how do you start broaching those conversations?
I mean, a lot of that, the first part is to get through product A and get that up and live and successful. After that, and concurrently with that, I think it's just keeping up with relevant apps. I mean, my company puts together apps with a lot of major media companies. So if you look at my phone, I have probably about 200 apps on my phone. And it's just constantly going out and seeing what's fresh, what's new, and how they could potentially, you know, pivot a little bit off of what one app is doing and add that into their offering, or come up with a new idea that, you know, hasn't been seen before. So I think it's just staying on top of the market, staying on top of their business, and trying to help them strategize.
I have one more question for you, Katherine, kind of not related to upselling, but a lot of times when a deal gets done and then it comes to you to get implemented, like what the partner understands and what your company understands may be different. So how do you deal with renegotiations? Like, do you do them yourself? Do you bring in the business development person? How does that work?
I mean, I tend to work where once it's handed off there, I mean, it depends on the client. Obviously, there's partners where the business development person will stay in touch with the client and should always stay in touch with the client, hands off. But when there's been a misunderstanding or, just a discrepancy of what was an expectations, I try to just restart. Say, okay, here's what we do, here's how we can help, here's how we can get over this hurdle here. Just always look for a solution. It's sometimes not possible, but most of the time you can come up with a win-win for both involved. I don't know if that helps answers your question.
Perfect. Anyone have questions on that first meeting? The next topic, just so you guys are ready, is negotiations. So this is more about the first kind of meeting and getting interest. Any questions on that? No hands up? Okay. Awesome. So now, you've got the yes. Whoever you met with agreed to move forward. And now you need to propose the terms of what the deal would look like. How do you do that?
I mean, for me, I always start verbally. You have probably one champion that you're working with in the company, so it's a it's a series of phone calls or meetings where you sort of lay out what the terms would be, what the gives and gets are, and once you feel like you're pretty much in agreement on that, including term and price and all of that, then you either put it in an email and say, hey, is this what we're talking about? Are we on the same page here? Yes. And then you drafted a proposal, you drafted an agreement. But I find that, every conversation you've had has kind of been building up to this, right? What's the value? What are the gives? What are the gets? So by the time you're ready to kind of put the terms down, you should be pretty close because you've had these discussions. It's just solidifying it. So at least for me, I always go verbal and then to sort of informal written in an email, just, hey, this is what we're talking about, and then I'll get the contract together.
Mary, Laurie?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Heidi. It starts off, I think a yes usually happens once they're already kind of comfortable with what's going to probably be thrown at you in terms of numbers. So, it's rare where they're just all in, like, oh, we think you're so wonderful, yes, no matter what. So, I think at the point of yes, both parties are kind of close, or at least within the range, like Heidi said. And I think it's a simple proposal, hopefully as simple as possible to get the contractual, sign off on the proposal because you want that signed, and to move into contract. So.
And when would you introduce price? Like at what point, someone's like, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Like at what point do you kind of weave that in, and how do you feel them out on that?
I think the best way to kind of get to the price is really make sure you have as an exact specification of what they want as well and what their expectations are. So you make them lay that out, because in order for them to take the time to actually now do this, is they're showing some commitment to you, saying, we really want this and this is what we want. Once they've taken the time to do that, they say, okay, well, you want all these things, it's gonna cost this, it's gonna cost that, you also want, as your company, so your account manager doesn't have that situation where what you sold is completely different from what you're trying to implement. You want to be as specific as possible. When you make the other person lay everything down and structure it, it's much easier to price that way, I think, and then it makes it seem like it's a response. It's not just, hey, I'm trying to get money from you. I'm actually trying to be responsive to what you want and what you need, and this is how much it's going to cost you. Right?
Any other suggestions for feeling it out?
No, I think the worst thing you could do is just send them an agreement with a price in it, right? You definitely, I think as Mary said, want to cover it. I mean, the harder thing is, I know when I was doing business development and signing publishers up, there wasn't as much specification. This was publishers for an ad network, so it was kind of sales, but it was, business development as well. And there really wasn't that much flexibility on price, right? It was revenue share, it was pretty standard, it was, here it was, so, and it wasn't the contract, it wasn't the agreement. So then, it was a little more crudely laid out. It was like, it's 60-40, what do you think? And then I had a little wiggle room, but it wasn't so much where it was a complex product I was building, and it was specifications, and okay, here's what it's gonna cost.
Again, it really depends on the business that you're in. When you're doing business development, at a law firm, it's way different from when you're doing business development at a tech company. I happen to be at a tech company. One of the ways that you could give price as well, or get to a price and, kind of remove it from yourself a little bit at this point, is I was working for a tech company. You basically get the product managers together or the solutions engineer together, of the potential client and your own company, and you start saying, hey, let's start laying this out, and then in this case, again, it was a technology company. One, you're covering two things. You're saying, I want to be as specific as possible, so we're managing expectations on both sides, and at the same time, you're saying, this is a way to actually, you're putting down price, and of course, you're always going to talk about it internally before you send it over to transom, but you're saying, this is a way of making it seem responsive, it's actually meeting a need, it doesn't seem, arbitrary, et cetera, so.
And to that point, like, let's say you have you have a concept of a deal, but there's a sticking point. Something gets heated, client retrades, whatever. How do you deal with those kind of difficult negotiations, and how do you find a leverage point to get to the other side of those?
I've actually always enjoyed the negotiations part, and I don't ever think the contract ever goes as smoothly as you expect it to. It's rare that the contract just gets signed, so you're always going to have sticking points. And I think, definitely for me, what was important was always to have another person involved. in my organization. So you need to be able to say, well, I can't agree to that because I need to get approval from my CEO. Or if you're the CEO, I need to get approval from my board. You need a place where you could say, I can't give you this approval, so you can't get bullied into agreeing to something you don't want to, be bullied into. I also, you definitely need someone else there, whether also it's your lawyer, if you don't have that person. Hey, my lawyer's handling this. He's just saying that this language, we can't agree to this because this language puts the company at risk, with other deals or whatever it is. A great excuse, but you need that go-to other than yourself, because if you're backed up against the wall and you're in a position where you're trying to sell, often that doesn't work very well for you.
Yeah, I would agree, because it's a relationship that you've cultivated, and you're the fun person, you're the nice person, you're the one's taken an interest in their business, you're their champion, and all of a sudden it's different. There are these key points that you're disagreeing on. So I agree. You don't want to put it in as simple terms as good cop, bad cops. That's absolutely not what it is, but just that other person that can just, give you the authority to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that. That's non-negotiable for us. And having an attorney on the terms and conditions, for me, absolute necessity. Someone to help with the legalese.
What about, how do you know when a deal can't get done? What if you just can't get it done? There's some term that they want you to agree to that just doesn't work. How do you know, and then how do you get yourself out of that so that, you still can maintain that relationship for the future?
I've had very few deals that haven't gotten done. Not that I'm so brilliant, but most of the key terms you've kind of figured out already. Yeah. You've both put a lot into it, so you sort of know. There was one time, it was actually around a deal with Verizon and AOL, I remember, where data became a huge issue, and that was in the terms and conditions, and who owned the data and how that was going to work, and that was sort of important to everybody, and everyone was going to walk away. And we came up with a very innovative solution to it, but it took a lot longer, and it meant bringing people over my head in, and attorneys. It became enormous. But I think that the main points of the deal, the walk, you figured those out. So I think and you put a lot into it. So I think it would take a lot to have the two parties just say, we're not going to do this. That's what you've been working on for months.
I would tend to agree with Heidi. It's just hopefully you're dealing in an ecosystem where pretty much everyone kind of knows what the playing field is and what's standard and what's not. But you are going to have that partner that tries that little extra, right? So if they say we're going to own everything after, hopefully they won't, because it's pretty unsophisticated. But sometimes if they have language like that, obviously you can't give away your IP because there's no point for it. So that's a non-negotiable, someone that tries to stick in the most favored nation clause, and you're like, well, why should I ever sign this? Then you know what? Sometimes I get a little bit sassy. Instead of arguing whatever they don't like, I just make it reciprocal. Just change, the two parties, and then put it back in. Okay, you want me to sign it? I'm going to put it in too, right? And so and then what they end up doing is erasing the whole thing, which is what I wanted in the first place, right? So you have to get a little bit, you have to get a little bit creative.
It's like, I know you are, but what am I?
I'm like, instead of saying this is ridiculous, why are you doing this? Just turn the language around, switch the parties, send them back in.
And they see how ridiculous it is.
Right. So it's you've got to be creative.
And what is the most favored nation for the people that may not know?
Oh, it's just kind of like when, let's say you're a little vendor, they know that they're trying to take a little bit, and they're like, hey, you know what, if we ever find out you gave your goods and products and services for, let's say, $0, or $10, we get those terms and conditions too. So it's ridiculous, because at this point in this life, I don't know how you enforce something like that anyway, but if it does
still ask for a lot.
Yeah, But every once in a while, you still see that crazy. Even NDAs, some people will, at this point in time, send a mutual NDA, right? If you're trying to talk, you're exchanging information, send one, but people still will send one-sided ones, and you can't just sign those. You think it's not that important. You have to look at it. You have to look at everything people send over.
Laurie, you have anything to add to?
No, I think the NDA is a really good one.
Any other questions on negotiation? Yeah.
On negotiation and talking about the deal itself, what if the deal is actually somewhat asymmetric? If you're a small party talking to a Fortune 500 firm, you're almost like definition the little person in the room. And you just going with somebody's method.
But your status is valuable for them.
Yeah.
Your value is big if you're in the room with them. That's what you have to remember.
But yes, you are, you know, in certain cases, you might have to give on, you know, certain things, of course. I'm not saying that, you know, that's part of negotiation. But it's, you know, if the big firms can be pretty reasonable too, right? So they may say something like, you know what, no matter what, you have to change this language here, otherwise it won't pass our IT security, and we want to give you the deal, but it won't pass our IT. In some situations like that, you're like, okay, you work out with your lawyer a way to craft a language that you don't feel like you're giving something away and everyone's comfortable, right? So I'm not saying don't negotiate, but I'm saying you can't be in a situation where they're trying to bully you and take something from you where the value of your business is zero, because then what's the point of doing the deal, you know?
Yeah, and actually, one thing that I just want to add to all of this stuff is sometimes people put down a term. They say, I want X. I want a pink folder. Just making this up. And really, they don't want a pink folder. There's something else that they want. There's something about the color pink that they want. There's something about the folder, the way it feels. So I think part of it also, when kind of people draw this hard line, unsophisticated negotiators, which you might run into on the other side, don't really articulate well why they want a specific term. So part of it is just kind of pulling out of them what they need, or if they don't know why they need it, kind of getting to the person who requested the pink folder to find out why they needed it, because that will often help you find a solution around it. I'm sure you probably did that with your Verizon data rights issue. It's like that's really kind of core to that strategy.
Yep, absolutely.
But remember that in some industries, there are some things that companies have standard that they can't remove, right? Like publishers, there are things in those deals that cannot be changed. So understand that too, especially as the little guy.
You had a question.
Yeah, it's probably the same in social as well, but like I'm more on the enterprise side. Let's say you walk into a place and then, you know, more likely than not, they have a team or team of consultants or like, you know, employees doing similar things, but for some reason they're not delivering it. But to go to the next layer, you have to get the approval of them. Like they have to evaluate you, but what you're delivering is kind of is what they're trying to do, but are not doing for some reason. You know,
So it's competitive, is that?
it's competitive. They
Like
have
an
an
internal
internal
department.
team that's failing to deliver, and you're walking in with a very similar product, but like superior product.
Yep.
But to get to the next stage, you need their approval. So they're like kind of your gatekeepers. Have you?
So I guess I'm not,
I think I know what you're trying to say. You're saying that sometimes you walk into an internal team where they're actually being somewhat hostile, because even though they know they need you because they haven't done it yet, they're a little
Or they're trying to
they're a
do it.
little defensive because
Right.
yeah. I mean, and I think actually, you know, as small technology vendors, you are in that position often, especially when you're working with bigger companies. And whenever you walk into a big company, the first, especially like the Googles and Microsoft, even AOL, sorry, you were there.
No,
It's
it's
like,
that exact conversation that I probably had with Heidi at one point.
And it's like, we could do this ourselves, you know, so, yeah, but that's their, if we wanted, we could do this ourselves, that's what they all say, you know, and they're like, we understand that, but, you know, right now, it's like you're doing other things, so we wanna actually compliment you.
right.
And
I was just gonna say, there's a piece of it that you can get, and I think most
Right.
big companies are always in buy versus build mode, right?
Right.
It's like, we might wanna do this, but we're not sure, but we're gonna sort of try it and see, but oftentimes they'll recognize it's better to partner with an expert, an outside company, to do it 100%.
Right.
So
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, so I think that if they already have something sort of up and running, you know, maybe you can get a small piece of it, show your value, and then eventually it spreads out a little bit.
Yeah, and it really is about positioning yourself as an expert too. That's why you're there, because they could do it, but can they do it as well in a quick time? You know, everything that you've done so far has led you to be the expert in that, and that's what you need to focus on.
And if possible, be a resource to that team, right? That's not always gonna work, because if they're hostile, they're hostile.
Yeah.
But if you're helping them look good and still standing out yourself with what your product or service does, then that's a win-win, and they can possibly become your champion.
I think just to follow up on what Laurie's saying, I think the best way to position yourself as an expert and to remove kind of like a lot of that questioning is if you have history or case studies of things, the successful, implementations you've already had, especially in an enterprise type sale, right? And you show, these are the 3 Fortune 500 clients that we've already done this for, and and they know it. That brings a certain level of, standard, hey, we're great, security, so that they can't really question you to that level, even if they might be feeling defensive or whatever. And hopefully you're turning the equation around and saying, we're actually here to help you and make you look good. If you choose us, the solution is that's going to be in place, it's going to be great, and you're going to look good.
Especially if there are people in their network that you have case studies of, that aren't other companies entirely, but are somewhat involved, then it will resonate even more with them. Because it proves that you already have experience with them, too.
Any other questions on negotiations? I have one more question for Katherine, actually. So now, let's say a deal does get reopened. They didn't have Mary doing the deal, and it wasn't spec'd out well, and the client signs on the dotted line. But then, when it comes to implementation, they start opening up terms. Do you negotiate them? Do you bring in the business development person?
It depends on the relationship. Most of the time, I am the one that's renegotiating that. If it gets to a point where we would lose the business, then I bring in the other person. It depends on the situation. Some of those aren't the cleanest and to deal with, and so I, trying to keep it as clean slate and as from here forward as possible is generally what I try to do. But I tend to take those myself.
Awesome. The last thing we're going to talk about is closing. So, any other questions on negotiations before we move on to closing? Great.
I have a question. How do you deal with client who compares your product to your competition, and you know that they have similar product? How do you prove that, hey, this is better, and they're aware of
Know
what
your
product-
differentiators, for sure. You've got to know your competitors as part of the ecosystem. So whatever it is, you've got to say, this is how we're different, and this is how it's going to add more value for you.
I agree. It's like differentiators on every level and why you're better. Obviously, that becomes part of your training. It's almost like you live and breathe it. But I think really part of it at the end of the day, especially if you're trying to sell a new technology, you have to know your product really, really well, and then just kind of like if they happen to bring up a competitor, well, yeah. Even though it seems that way, quickly be able to say why you're different. And the reason why I say quickly is because at some level, especially if you're talking to business people, let's say, or marketing people with the technology, it all sounds the same. So, you could say, I have this platform and it sounds great. And then you think, it's so much better than company B's. And company B goes in and pitches. You have to realize at the end of the day, you're passionate about your stuff, but they're just kind of like, this all sounds the same to me.
And if you're lucky enough to have a good client list, that can be a differentiator because a lot of companies will make herd mentality decisions. So if you say we have Google and we have AOL and we have Microsoft, then you're going to think, okay, this is a great one to pick. All of these have picked it too, so I can't go wrong.
And you should know your differentiators, but also if there are big ones that you can bring up without mentioning your competition, but just as part of your pitch, features that you focus on, then maybe they won't ask the question at all. Right?
Yeah, and I think to add to that, like, if fundamentally you're selling similar products, think about other ways you can differentiate yourself. If you're a small company selling against a big company, we're small, we provide more personalized service. If you're a big company selling against a small company, we have more resources to bring to bear. Like, it's spinning the same thing, but depending on what side you're coming from. Any other questions on negotiations? All right, so now closing. So
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is there a question or no?
I just wanted to make sure we weren't ignoring.
So you've got the deal. You're kind of going through negotiations, but how do you create urgency? Because sometimes these things can drag out forever, especially when you're dealing with big companies. It can take forever to get a deal done. So what are some strategies that kind of create urgency to get the deal closed faster?
I mean, I know at third screen, I'm almost gonna call them parlor tricks in a way. Like we would say, hey, you know, we're doing this big panel, this big promotion, this big press release. We really wanna include you, but here's when we're doing it. It's at this event. So if you wanna take advantage of this, then you've gotta get on board now. Or not really most favored nation pricing, but early pricing. Sort of, you know, we're bringing a customer for this early pricing. You wanna be a part of it, then I need you to sign on now. So those types of things, you know, fear, greed, urgency, a little bit of fear, like I'm gonna miss this opportunity if I don't sign on now.
You can also take a look at what's happening in the landscape of the industry too. If things are shifting with things that their competitors are doing, then you can prove more value to be timely too.
I would have to agree with Heidi, and it's also knowing your client, you know, I mean, the person that you have this great relationship with that championed you, that person may be looking for a little bit of press. I mean, you never know, you know, would love to be quoted in a press release where he's kind of seen as the champion of this new solution that his division did. And so, like, hey, you know, we have all these press releases that are, just like Heidi said, I don't want to call it a parlor trick, but, you know, we want to get you on a call with our marketing person because she actually wants to lay out all the press releases and articles that are coming out for this at the end of this year, and, you know, we want to start working with you so that we're ready. And that actually, like Heidi said, will create a sense of urgency. Like, he'll be like, hey, let's get this done, you know, this is going to be really good.
And then mentioning other people too. I mean, I know when we would switch from just a network to a platform, I think we had Hearst, CBS, USA Today, and Weather Channel that were part of this little sponsorship promotion we were doing. And they were all taking a long time, you know, just kind of, so we'd be like, hey, USA Today, we're doing this thing, and Weather Channel's in, and Hearst is in, and, you know, we want to make sure you're in too. And then to USA Today, we'd say everybody else is, so we kind of moved them all along quickly. We're like, please don't call each other.
Now, like, how do you figure out in advance things that might like slow down the deal? So, you know, whether it's like technical hurdles down the road or legal hurdles, how do you figure that out in advance so you can make sure you're ahead of the game?
Well, I mean, I actually think that sometimes, you know, it depends on how the deal goes, but the thing is, sometimes even before a contract, especially if you know the contract's gonna be huge, make sure there's a simple term sheet, you know, with all the major terms that you guys have agreed on, and just make sure those major points are agreed upon. Then you go to contract and just make sure that the lawyers have all of the issues ironed out. Because I have had a couple of situations where you think everything's ironed out, and then the lawyer saw it last because, you know, of the bureaucracy of the place or something like that, and something came up that you totally weren't expecting. I mean, usually it's resolvable, but you don't want that heart attack, you know.
And usually it's in, at least for me, it's always in the terms and conditions. It's not in the points I've laid out. So, but once you kind of stub your toe on the same thing a couple of times, you're like, okay, like data's a huge issue for everybody. So then you can sort of, if you have the same type of customer, you can sort of forewarn them and just say, hey, you know, FYI, this is kind of what this clause is going to look like, and how do you think this is going to go through internally? Here's what we've sort of done in the past. So you can troubleshoot in advance, and that will accelerate the slowdown.
And I think something important to know when you're in the stage of closing the deal is that it is time to get stuff together, because when the deal happens, especially as the small guy, sometimes there's a lot that needs to happen really quickly once it's signed. So once you start negotiating, have all of everything ready to go, know what you need to do and what is actionable once the deal signs.
And actually, like a related point, like, you know, do you provide all the terms at once, or do you layer them in? Because sometimes deals can be really complicated. So how do you propose terms? And that, I know we talked about like verbally first, but like, how do you kind of go from verbal to contract?
Well, for me, I think most of the time, unless the client wanted to do it, in which case I preferred it, because I actually, you don't want to put it down first. You want them to kind of throw something over so you can react, as in most situations. But lots of times what ended up happening was, because you're the one that's trying to move the deal along, you end up saying, hey, the next step is a term sheet, why don't I send something over that you could edit, right? Trying to get them to now take the next step, right? So it often happened that way, where we threw over a term sheet, you know, with all of the terms. We're like, based on, you know, our correspondence and our meetings to date, we think these are the terms that we think both parties can agree on. Would love your edits. You send that over, and that kind of starts the process.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I probably like over prepare for this stuff, so I'll have the verbal conversation with them, so I sort of know in my head where it's going. And what I find is like then if I incorporate it into a term sheet, somehow it looks super scary sometimes, then where it's like, this is what? But if I kind of send an email, it's like, hey, I think this is kind of the conversation we had, I think this is what we're talking about, what do you think? Maybe there's a few edits, but it's not in that formal document or that pre-formal document, and so then it's simpler, and ultimately it did come from them, but I'm always the one, like I will always take the initiative to put the terms down or to get them from them verbally and then send it back to them. A, I'm impatient, and B, you know, I'm the one that wants to make this deal happen, I'm driving it, so it's gonna, you know, be more likely to get done in the way I want it to if I send that first pass over.
Now,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead, please.
Oh, no. I think, you know, one thing, this is sort of an aside, but I have been in situations on some very larger and more strategic deals where I actually was the guy in the middle, or the gal, where sometimes I was fighting with my own counsel. And your counsel, you hired, it's a strange situation to be, but you know, you're fighting with your client, you're also fighting with your own counsel because you're paying your counsel to protect your interests, and they're basically trying to do everything to make sure you're protected. But sometimes you work with a guy who's so conservative that you're like, I need to do business, you know, it's like, okay, you know, according to what you're saying, I'm paying you and you're not letting me do anything. And so it's like, you have to push them to be creative, especially with a big deal, because you're like, you need to find a way to get me
Right, make this happen.
Right, you know,
Right.
so.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So, I mean, sometimes dealing with large customers, large organizations, the question of when the deal is really closed is not so clear. So, I'm sure you all have experiences in this field, you know, where you dealing with a large corporation, getting to the point where you actually have a signed contract. It's going to take a long time, and they want you to start delivering your services, your product much earlier. Any learnings about this situation?
I've had a few where we've actually had clients and we've started to do the work and we've done the work and we've delivered and we still have not had a signed contract. Possibly not the safest way to go, but we had established relationships with the partners that were heavily entrenched, and you know, it worked out in those situations. And I think we found with some media companies, not in my particular job now, but in past experience, a lot of media companies moved a little bit slower than it took for them to actually launch the campaign. So.
Was that like the first deal you had done with those companies, like the first signing, or was it like more new business but from an existing?
It was new business that had come on board from the CR.
You were eager to take the business.
We were eager to take the business. We were startup at the time.
To start, and bureaucracy is going to take a while, but there are some risks you take.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've done in the past is I'll just get them to approve the terms via email.
Yeah.
So at least if something kind of goes bad, you're like, but we agreed on these.
Right.
And more and more, like, you know, if it goes to court, which you probably wouldn't do, but like they will uphold email as an agreement.
Yeah.
So I think it just gives something to point to.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Have you ever been at the point of closing and something tragic happens with one of your key stakeholders, like a death or Hurricane Sandy, someone's completely lost something and it completely stops the forward momentum of the deal? What kind of tact do you have to show that you're sensitive, but like, when can we resume? I'm experiencing that, and I don't know the balance between, you know, being diplomatic and obviously sensitive to the death, but also trying to understand timing for when we can pick up the conversations again and move forward.
Is it a company you're dealing with? Like, could you
A company,
sort of
but
show
the-
your condolences, but then move to somebody else to kind of pick
The
things
general
up?
manager is the decision maker. I'm dealing with the key person who writes the checks and who makes the decision.
Kevin, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, I just want, I mean, has it been a significant amount of time between the
About
two?
2 months, but
Okay.
he's still not ready to move forward. I just don't want to come across as being insensitive.
I think that's tricky. I don't know what you can. I mean, I'm assuming it's a death or something horrible like that.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's an elegant way to pick up the conversation and nudge it along, other than just sort of, informally showing your support and staying in touch, like, hey, I'm sure you're still kind of pulling yourself out, but just wanted to keep you updated on this happening in the industry, and sometimes, like, I remember having an experience, like, it was not at a big company, small too, and it really changed everything for them. Like, they didn't run that business anymore afterwards. Like, death sometimes does bizarre things besides just postpone a contract being signed, so you just, I don't know.
And kind of keep with that lead with value. Just keep leading with value. I mean, the good news is you're closer to the finish line, but I would say use the same follow-up techniques you would use when you're prospecting and just kind of go back to them until they're ready. More questions? I have one thing that I want to ask, like pricing. You get there, let's just say, like generally, you're not at a contract, but you generally know that you want to do business, you have a sense of the terms, but price becomes the sticking point. How do you negotiate around that? And, if you're going to discount, how do you discount in a way that doesn't kind of discredit the value you're bringing?
I went through a negotiation recently where the partner wanted to basically stay dark for 1 year. They didn't want to roll out any new products in 2013, or 2012, but they wanted to extend the partnership in some way and at some point come back and develop. And for us to keep that and to keep services going, it was a matter of just trying to say, okay, if we can offer you this discounted amount of pricing during this year with more development work, then next year you can make it up with the additional pricing and market rate at that point.
I mean, sometimes contracts are worth a certain amount, so if you extend the term, then that's a way that I've gotten around, discounting a little bit. So if this was like a 1-year contract, maybe it becomes a 2-year contract. If it's 2, maybe it becomes 3. And then in some way the value of the contract is the same. I mean, I think one thing it's important. I mean, it should just be sort of standard and note is not just to have an agreement that nobody talks about discounted pricing, because that can get out of control pretty quickly in a small industry.
And actually, just before I answer your question, one other thing I'd add is at least for us when we've negotiated pricing, we always look for other things that we can get of value.
Right.
So especially sometimes when you're early in your business and you're trying to get that reference customer, like getting them to commit to doing that reference, for example, right, is value. And that's something you might be able to say, well, normally my price is X, but I'll give you a 20% discount if you act as a reference customer, or you do a case study with me or something else.
Or press even.
Or
better.
press. Something that will give me kind of intangible value that is beyond just the price.
I agree. I think that's when they're demanding a discount from you, and what Veronica says, especially if you're early stage and you're trying to get more reference customers, if they ask for that 20% discount, you have no choice but to give it. Make sure you get something back, which is that press release or that case, and see it as a marketing cost.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and with Fortune 500 companies, that's often how the negotiation goes. They're always going to ask for that discount, and you're like, okay, great, then can we do some kind of press or an event, or can we reference you?
You had a question, so.
There's a certain blueprint to all of biz dev, but then each individual situation is different. You have to get creative. I'd like to hear maybe a 30 to 60-second story on the most crazy, out-of-the-box creative way you guys landed a client. I think it would give some perspective, I think. Take a second if you need it.
Okay, so I have an idea. This maybe isn't the craziest, but it is all about the personal connection, right? And while I was writing my book, I was going around to different places trying to get new inspiration. Stumbled upon this tea shop in the West Village called David's Tea. Became my new favorite spot. And
I actually live right around the corner.
You do? It's amazing, isn't it? So I, through Twitter, developed a relationship with them. Ended up meeting the person who runs PR, and now they're going to be part of my book tour. And we're going to be doing events at their shops in different cities.
Sweet. I mean, I guess one of the, I don't know if it's crazy, but the Bravo story was, one that I kind of liked that was non-traditional. But I guess both of my other ones, it's not crazy. It was just a more difficult sell, involved the wireless carriers. So the first was I ran a little LGBT portal, and in order to get distribution for it. My tactic was to get it on the wireless carrier's deck, and they, at that time, kind of functioned like an AOL or a CompuServe or a Prodigy. They were all extremely conservative, and we're kind of looking at, news, weather, sports, and I was like, yay, this is where you want to be. Especially like Sprint was the first one we were talking to, and they were in Kansas City, and they're like, yeah, really. But when we showed them that gay people had high disposable income, were trend-driven, carried the phone, were out a lot, we sold them on it. So it's just kind of, taking a non-traditional approach. I guess it goes back to standard business development to make a very conservative Fortune 500 company see the value in something a little bit different. In my wireless company, Third Screen Media, the one where Veronica and I and Mary and I met, actually, there was no advertising on cell phones back at that time, and that probably dates me. But we went in and we were talking to them in advertising language. We were saying CPMs and ROI, and we had all these whiteboards, and we were like foaming at the mouth with excitement, and they were just kind of like, huh. So we had to learn to talk their language, which was ARPU, average revenue per user, and we were just like, look, your subscription fees are gonna, bottle out soon. You're not gonna be able to make any more from subscription fees, and you have all this content on these new portals, and you're not letting any of the publishers monetize it. So pretty soon, that content's gonna go away, and then your subscription fees are gonna go down, and then the carriers, all of a sudden, they were all ears. So it was sort of taking what was our fluency, which was advertising, and trying to change it into their fluency, which was our fluency. I guess it was feeling their pain. So I think initially we went in like, hey, advertising's great, you can make lots of money. And they were thinking, oh my gosh, if somebody sees an ad on the phone, they're gonna quit Verizon and go to Sprint. So we sort of had to turn it around and show them how all the publishers were gonna leave and they weren't gonna get more subscription fees anyhow.
I think to add to that, in the early days, it's not crazy, but it's, a little bit it's a little bit out of the box. When I was a mobile technology vendor, I had competitors, so how do I get the business when my competitors are doing the same thing? Like Heidi said, it's all about relationships. I took the time to make sure I was very good friends with people at AT&T and Verizon, which were the two largest carriers. You couldn't, this was before Steve Jobs and an iPhone and everything, you couldn't get your content up without working with the carriers, or anything for that matter. So it took years of banging on their door, but I developed very good relationships with both AT&T and Verizon. A lot of times I have to say, it wasn't price and it wasn't the technology. I promised XYZ media companies we were also having a hard time working with carriers. Hey, I have a relationship with Verizon, but I don't have one with AT&T. I was like, well, I'll introduce you to AT&T. That was the deciding factor. Can't say it was my technology. I mean, I could say this in hindsight.
Yeah, it's your expertise.
Well, no, it's like they don't care about that marginal difference at the end of the day. It's like who's going to give you the deal and get the what they want. So I can't say that's outrageous, but it's being creative.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also being ahead of the game, and with some of the clients that I've had who've tried to make a shift from text marketing to something more or something more in depth. Is really having that partnership and the trust of going into the media companies with them and pitching the deals, and being prepared to build out systems and things to show them that we're in it, we're going to be a reliable partner, and we're going to put forth the effort.
So to draw a theme from all of your stories, it sounds like, much like in biz dev and in life, if you understand where your customers coming from, what their needs are, what they really want, that will then position yourself to then give the ultimate pitch.
Exactly. It's really, you need to understand their business and where you can put in, and vice versa.
And you really have to be able. It almost has to be natural. You want to enjoy it or like it, but connecting the dots. You can connect two dots that somebody else can't, right? So.
That's right.
Now, one of the questions we got asked beforehand was whether you would use outside consultants to help with business development, or is it something that you can outsource? And actually, Mary, since you do.
I'm actually doing that right now as a consultant. I'm doing some business development for companies out there, and I think if it's a fit going both ways. I only work with companies where I know I can understand and explain their product. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to do well by them. I'm actually going to say something a little bit controversial here, but I think, with the way tech startups are going, especially technology-based startups, it depends on the stage of the company as to whether you actually even need someone that's doing business development in a complete role. And what I mean by that is, for a very early stage company, the company that I was VP of Business Development, I was also a co-founder in management, so I was wearing both hats. Not only did I do my job, but I was also looking out for the company's bottom line. So I feel like the way I always did business development, I was trying to bring in money in some way at some point, or being very strategic. But I would never, as the founder of a startup, I would never hire somebody that came in and just went around and socialized all the time, and I didn't see money at the end of the day, right? So it's interesting, and I also think with a lot of very technology-oriented startups, sometimes the product development guy is actually the best business development
I think that's
person,
right.
because
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, because they understand the product, they know what technology partnerships or what kind of relationships are going to enhance the product or actually make it sell better. So I actually think, at the beginning stages, if there's a CEO and a kick-ass product manager, you actually don't need a biz dev person. So, and also if you have a great sales guy, the sales guy can do, the most exact sales guy can actually do most of the sales, the formulaic stuff, and then strategically do the strategic deals as needed. So, I really think a biz dev thing is a skill that everyone needs to have on some level. The CEO, the product management, even the top sales guy. I think the company does get to a certain point where having a biz dev person actually go out there and think about strategic things makes sense. But does this make any sense?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is I think that's how a lot of technology companies are being structured. They're just renaming the salesperson business development.
Exactly.
They're really doing sales, but it's less intimidating because nobody wants to meet with the sales guy. So it's like, this is our strategic alliance, this person or business development, but really they're selling.
Yeah.
But as an entrepreneur in a small business that doesn't need a biz dev person, the value I see in consultants is bringing them in once you start talking about a deal. Because then there is that other person that you can help negotiate with and bounce off with you. And then you're closer to making the revenue as well, so you can justify the cost.
And actually, to that point, are there common mistakes that entrepreneurs make that people should have red flags for? So if you're kind of early in your business, things that you should watch out for when doing
Just
deals.
giving too much away. I think you're so eager to get that deal that you give it away, and you do have some value. I mean, there's concessions, of course, that you'll make, maybe your discount, maybe this, but you're worth something. That's why you've brought this company to the table or this partner to the table. So don't give it away.
That's a great point. Any more questions? Well, I certainly learned a lot, so this is a good refresher. So please join me in thanking you so much.